Right, I'm the chairperson for this session, everyone. My name's Hamish Campbell and I'm on the NZAS Council. And one of my roles there is to head up the editorial subcommittee, and we produce this thing. Everybody aware of it?
Yes.
I heard a few voices. I was really pleased to hear the Minister this morning talking about Auckland and geology. I'm a geologist, and in this lovely latest issue of Science Review, we've got an excellent article on the Devora project and the current state of knowledge of the Auckland volcanic field. I'll leave it at that. All right, now we've got 4 invisible scientists whom we're now going to hear from, and they've got 20 minutes each, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Pamela Mace from MPI, and the talk is Perceptions and Misconceptions about the State of New Zealand's Fisheries. Pamela.
Thank you.
And I'm going to be a stricter chairman than the last one. 20 minutes each, and hopefully 15 so we can have some questions. There's a challenge.
I didn't know I was on Invisible Science, but in some ways this is what this talk is about. I'm a scientist who's going to be trying to give you a positive view of fisheries, which is contrary to what you may have seen, what you will have seen, I would think, in the media, particularly the last few years. So I'll talk a little bit about the actual perceptions that are out there, give you one slide which is a global overview, talk about what's happening in developed countries, summarise the status of New Zealand fisheries in New Zealand, talk about common misconceptions, contrast terrestrial versus marine situations, and of course give some conclusions. So, perceptions. You're probably aware that Lincoln University does a triennial public perceptions of New Zealand's environment, and the last one that they completed was in 2016. And what it found, which is quite consistent with what previous ones have found, is air and native bush and forests perceived to be in the best condition, rivers, lakes and wetlands, and marine fisheries perceived to be in the worst state. And most respondents considered the condition of New Zealand's native land and freshwater plants and animals to be adequate or good, which is significantly at odds with reports from the Department of Conservation and MFE. I really admire what DOC is doing on a very limited budget, trying to bring species back from the brink of extinction. I think they're doing an admirable job, but not one single marine fish or shellfish species in New Zealand is even remotely on the brink. A little bit more from Lincoln's survey. So one thing I won't cover and I can't explain is they went from paper surveys in the beginning to electronic, and things went dramatically down. They didn't give a reason for that, and I can't either. But just showing you that, you know, how different things are, I would say that, I mostly want to compare native terrestrial plants and animals with marine fisheries. And there you can see that they are perceived, both in the past and present, to be doing much better than marine fisheries. Our coastal waters and beaches, which I also added in here, are perceived to be doing extremely well, despite all of the sedimentation, pollution, dumping problems and so forth. And this is the quality or condition of those things. This is the quality of management. The quality of fisheries management is perceived to be very, very poor. The quality of management of our native plants and animals is perceived to be, well, it's actually perceived to be mostly adequate or good. Another way of looking at this is to look at, here I lumped those two, quality or condition and quality of management into one, and also grouped together good and very good and bad and very bad. and compared them here. What's missing from this graph is the category called adequate, which actually didn't have much variation across these factors. It varied from about 31 to 35%. So again, looking at native land plants and animals, on balance, more people think they're doing really well than poorly, and it's the other way around for fisheries. So why is this? It is amazing to me, and part of it is the way fisheries is portrayed in the media. So, for example, if you look at the global statistics, this is FAO statistics, they haven't really changed that much in recent years, but the most recent report has the underfish component. This is for the world's major target fisheries, as being around 10.5%, fully fished 58%, overfished 31%. This is the appropriate way of representing it, but this is the way that it's generally represented in the media. They say almost 90% of our fisheries are in trouble. What fully fished means is they're being optimally managed in a sustainable way. Now, it's not to say that things are great, because having this many as being in an overfished state is not great. And there are some regions that are actually not doing well. This includes almost all of Asia, parts of Africa, and some but not all parts of the high seas. However, developed countries, I include New Zealand here, is generally performing well and getting better. And so I'll show you that in the next few slides. This is the US, which is one country that is doing well. Their fish stock sustainability index has been increasing, although it's potentially showing signs of plateauing. And it's complicated the way this index is derived, but basically the US has poured enormous amounts of money into its science and its fisheries management, and is doing, and that's reflected in this score. Another way of looking at this, they classify their stocks according to whether the overfishing is occurring, which is a rate of extraction that's too high, or the population is overfished, which means it's too low. So in 2016, 9% of stocks subject to overfishing and 38% overfished. These are the comparable figures for New Zealand. I must say though that this is only their major stocks, whereas this is all of our scientifically evaluated stocks. We're comparable in terms of overfished. We look to be higher in terms of overfishing, and I'll show you our stats in a bit more detail a couple of slides on. The EU has enormous fisheries management problems. You've got all those adjacent countries all vying for what they consider to be their share of the pie, and it always adds up to more than 100%. So their progress has actually been a lot later than in either the US or in New Zealand. However, they have been making progress. So this is fishing mortality. They've for the 85 major stocks, and this is for the year 2014. And fishing mortality has, this is the optimal, by the way, this horizontal line is the optimal level. So it is way above optimal levels, way too high for quite a long period of time. It's now dropped precipitously, and there's always a lag in the response of the biomass to reductions in fishing mortality. But, you know, in more recent years, that's been improving a lot, and the EU is now seeing quite enormous progress. New Zealand situation, I'll just give you a quick summary. We do scientific evaluations for what we hope is a progressively greater number of stocks every year. So scientifically evaluated stocks, they account for 72% of the tonnage, 79% of the value of landings. Record number this year, although it only went up by, 2 or 3, but we try and increase it every year. And of those, in terms of stocks, scientifically evaluated stocks that have no sustainability issues, it's 133 stocks. Stocks that do have sustainability issues, it's 27. 83% of scientifically evaluated stocks have no sustainability issues. What we need to do with these ones is simply reduce the catches to rebuild, or in extreme cases, we close fisheries to enhance the fastest rate of rebuilding. Put corrective management in action place for all of these stocks, and it takes time, but we have had quite a few success stories. Show you it in a little bit more detail. This is a complicated graph. We've actually got 4 performance metrics: the soft limit, the hard limit, overfishing, and the management target. Management target is maximum sustainable yield. Overfishing means a rate of extraction that's too high. A hard limit is the worst situation of all, which is where a stock has gotten so low that you should consider closing it. And the soft limit, this is the what's equivalent to the term overfished, and this is the main metric that we use. So green is good, yellow is okay. Being below the management target, though, isn't a bad thing. You expect stocks to fluctuate around their targets. Orange is getting worse, and red is the actual bad situation. In terms of the number of stocks, we do increase the number of stocks that assessed each year or scientifically evaluated. In terms of number of stocks, these non-green parts look bigger, but in terms of the volume of landings, this is influenced by a lot of very small stocks. In terms of volume of landings, they don't make up much. In particular, the stocks that are in bad shape, the red ones, don't make up much of the landings at all because they've mostly been closed or had their total allowable catches severely reduced. So the point here is that of the scientifically evaluated landings, 97% have no sustainability issue, which I think is a pretty good result. However, what we usually hear in the media in particular, but also from some of those other activists who may have lost their scientific objectivity, in my view anyway, is that just because a stock is, they often characterise a stock that's below the management target as endangered, collapsed, in trouble, or on the brink of extinction, when in fact, as I mentioned, we expect stocks to fluctuate around their management target. So being below is not a bad thing. In fact, you expect them to be below about half of the time, and they're only below about 25 to 30% of the time. But the other point is that even stocks that are overfished or depleted are always vastly more abundant than endangered terrestrial species. Next slide, I pick out a few examples of stocks that have been taken, of land species that have been taken off the endangered species list, and they're all from 2016 as it happened. There have been some, what have been called conservation success stories in recent years. So terrestrial species no longer classified as endangered. Most of these are under the United States Endangered Species Act. Grizzly bears have increased to 700 to 1,000. So that's considered good enough to call them not endangered. Green sea turtles, at least in Florida, 2,250 nesting females, no longer endangered. Manatees, 6,000, no longer endangered. White-tailed deer in the US, 1,000 now. Giant pandas have increased to about 1,860 adults, maybe 2,000 in total. They've been taken off the IUCN Red List, no longer considered to be endangered. Just because they've been taken off the list of the endangered category, it just means they've been downgraded, or if you like, upgraded. away from extinction. So they still have some kind of a threat status in the US and other places. There still are some kind of protections. But they're considered to be in a relatively good state. Let's take a fisheries example. Northern cod, Newfoundland cod, is often considered to be a typical example of a fishery. It crashed this is landings, it crashed in the early 90s. A moratorium was put on in 1992 for no fishing. There actually has been some fishing, you just can't see it on this axis very well. But they've been doing, Canada's considered to do surveys every year, and we're now in a situation where the latest stock assessment in 2016 showed that the stock is at least potentially on the road to recovery. I think the jury's still out as to whether or not it's coming back, and it's mostly environmental, by the way. In any case, it's not considered to be in a good state at the point that it's at now. Not considered to be in a good state at all, but even so, there are an estimated 894 million cod out there. So you're just talking completely different numbers. We're saying poor status, 894 million, good status, 1,000. Now, okay, part of that's the difference between fish and mammals, so, you know, you've got to take that into account as well. Orange Roughy, and I've just taken the figures from 2013 because that was before our most recent updated assessments that indicate that some of the major orange Roughy stocks have recovered. So this is prior to recovery, and this is just all the different stocks, I won't go through them, but it's a low productivity fish species. Even so, when they were considered to be depleted, and almost all of them were considered to be depleted in 2013, still 165.5 million. So even for a low productivity species, and the numbers that you're talking about are quite amazing. And I should say that most of the fisheries for these stocks were closed for a period of time, or else severely reduced in size. It's also true that marine stocks have a tremendous capacity to rebuild. So my favourite example is Georgia Spanks scallops off of the east coast of the United States. So this is fishing mortality in the red. It got to absolutely phenomenally high, ridiculously high levels in the early 90s. It had been going up. The stock had been low for as long as the stock had been assessed. There was some concerted effort to put in place management with teeth in around 1994, and the fishing mortality plummeted. The biomass in the blue responded very quickly because scallops are relatively short-lived. So over a period of only 9 years, the stock size increased 23-fold, and it's now usually in first, or at least in the top 3 most valuable fish species in the US. We've also got a homegrown example, which is Hoke. It got to be quite low, particularly in the west, when there was 7 consecutive years of very poor recruitment to the fishery, very poor reproductive success, and the quotas were reduced from 250,000 down to 90,000 in several steps, and the stock has now responded and is well above the target zone. So that's just a kind of a quick tour of just trying to say that, well, I probably have glossed over, there are negative things happening in that marine environment. Absolutely, there are negative things. But I'm trying to say that fisheries, at least the direct impacts of fishing, the direct impacts of fishing on fish and shellfish stocks are doing well. And in New Zealand, things are doing extremely well. So just to conclude, New Zealand fisheries are performing well overall. There are issues, including many things I haven't discussed. I mean, I'm trying to outline the positives more so than the negatives. These need to be acknowledged and addressed, and they are being, perhaps not as fast as what some people would like. Marine resources can still be managed for food, livelihoods and sustainability, as opposed to many terrestrial native resources that require restoration. And in many cases, and New Zealand is, one of the prime examples, they're being rescued from the verge of extinction. But, I don't really need to tell this audience this, but don't believe everything you see, hear or read about the status of fisheries in popular media. Sometimes it's balanced, but unfortunately that seems to be becoming more and more rare that that's the case, and there's obviously a need to take an analytical and objective approach. So thank you.
Right, well, we've got time for questions. Yes?
One thing that strikes me is that when you look at the animals on the endangered species list, they were not species we eat.
Sorry,
We can't hear.
Okay.
they were not species that.
Spoke about the endangered animals. Those were not species we eat. But when you spoke about fish, those were species that we, as a group, eat.
Well, one of the.
A billion Hoke, right?
Yeah.
But if a nation like Japan ate 6 Hoke per year per individual, that's a billion Hoke. They're all gone. So the scale of the drain on those resources is also sort of significantly different orders of magnitude.
Actually,
so the balance is actually pretty critical here.
I agree, and I also pointed out that comparing mammals with fish is not not a direct comparison. But the deer that were mentioned are actually a species that was and is eaten. So, that's not totally, your point's not totally valid. But yeah, I think I was pointing out, what do we consider to be endangered? So, but what happens with fisheries when we say that they're overfished, and in particular using what we call the hard limit in New Zealand, we close the fisheries and they can rebound extremely quickly. More quickly than what terrestrial animals can, for example. So yeah, you wouldn't have every person in China eating 6 Hoke a year, because we wouldn't allow that many to be caught.
Yes.
Just wondering, are there any examples or instances of marine fish species actually being driven to complete extinction?
Oh, well, that was the point I meant to make. Apparently there is one. Someone told me about it, but I forget what it is. So marine fish species and shellfish species, very few, maybe one, maybe 2, I don't know. Marine mammals is a completely different story, and that is something that is not, I didn't include here because that's overall not really a positive story. It is, again, one of those issues that need to be acknowledged and addressed, and we need to be doing what we can to increase the size of marine mammal stocks. There have been quite a few success stories there as well. Yeah.
Thanks, Peter Griffin from the Science Media Centre. Thanks, Callum. Very interesting. There's obviously a disconnect between the evidence base that you've identified and are working from, and the public perception of the integrity of our fisheries management, and that's played out over the last year very prominently in the media. I'm just wondering what MPI has done reflecting on all of that, because the media is going to continue to be a really important channel in moulding public perception and opinion on this subject. What if, with all that's gone out around Achilles and even academics sort of at loggerheads over this issue, presenting different types of evidence, what have you learned internally? What's MPI going to do to try and improve the situation?
Well, I probably can't speak on behalf of all of MPI because my role is just the science. What we are hoping to do, and what I'm hoping MPI will do, is to get more proactive stories out there. Not stories that are spin, that just talk about the good things, but more balanced stories and that where there are issues, talk about what we're doing to address them.
Last question.
Really interesting and really heartwarming. But one of the things that's interested me is krill, which are not seen as a fish we used to, but now we're learning to send, apparently Norwegians send great big ships down to the Antarctic, and it's probably the bottom of the beginning of the food chain, or seaweed can start to be harvested, which actually could really change ecosystems, because comparing terrestrial versus fish, we don't normally mess with the environment, but as we start to get, well, we do in some ways in pollution, but I mean,
And on terrestrial, you don't mess with the environment?
No, we do mess with the
Oh,
environment.
okay.
In the marine, we
yeah.
can't mess with the Pacific Ocean quite the
Oh,
same
I see
way.
what you mean, yeah.
But as we start to learn how to harvest some of those things, like krill, like seaweed, whatever, are we in danger of all of a sudden being caught out, and actually your billion fish could disappear because the beginning of the food chain is being taken?
In my view, it doesn't really matter what part of the food chain you're taking food from. What matters is how effective your management is, and in the Antarctic, Pamela has to be one of the most successful international management organisations. Convention for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. So I would be fairly confident. I mean, they're the first entity to take an ecosystem approach. Antarctic toothfish is actually one of the, if not the best fish managed fishery in the world, then in the top 5. They've done a stupendous job with it. So I wouldn't worry so much about that. There are lots of models that say, you know, what are the implications of exploiting different parts of a food chain. Some say leave all the large predators, take the lower levels. Actually, the models tell you almost anything you want them to tell you because they're so complex. But you know, I think it's how good is the management entity, and I could put up a list of the ones I wouldn't trust, and I could put up a list of the ones I would trust. So, Pamela, I would though.
Okay. Thank you, Pamela. That was
Happy to take any
fascinating
more
talk.
questions.
I'll ask you about Toaroa later. All right, our next speaker, Graham LeGros. I should introduce you.
Yeah.
Graham's from the Malahide Institute, and the topic is the role of independent research organisations in the New Zealand science ecosystem.
You could help me change.